All right, welcome to today's Explainer, where we're mapping out the anatomy of what was, quite frankly, a truly frantic era. We're looking at the 20th century, but not just as a timeline of events. We're looking at it as humanity's breathless, desperate struggle to avoid being entirely swallowed up by a cold, material universe. It was a time of deep existential panic, you know? Humanity was basically rushing forward, fleeing this terrifying fear of losing its very soul to the machinery of the modern world. So let's dive right in.
So if we peel back the layers of history, it reveals this one burning question hanging over the entire era. Which thought will draw the face of the new human? Think about it. Humanity was caught in this unprecedented, massive contradiction. We were simultaneously more cowardly, yet more courageous, more technologically advanced, but also more systematically cruel and oppressed than ever before. People were scrambling for a lifeline, a philosophy, or some kind of system that could save them from just melting into mere objects. In this explainer, we're going to attempt to map out exactly how that search unfolded, where it totally failed, and what the potential solution might actually be.
Section 1. The Cracking Membrane. End of the Old World.
We really have to kick things off with World War I. But we're not just talking about a clash over borders here. This was the literal shattering of a protective shell. Before the war, there was this metaphorical membrane that kept all these volatile global energies in check. You had the Asia of state power acting as this incredibly resilient shield for the silent, kind of dreamy Asia of melancholy. And meanwhile, traditional imperial Europe was actively containing the dynamite-like energy of the Renaissance. But look at the post-war state. That shield is completely gone. Empires absolutely crumbled, leaving these chaotic, unprotected populations totally exposed to the raw, unfiltered forces of history. And with the collapse of all those traditional authorities, a massive, radical shift occurred. As it was perfectly put, the individual died, the mass was born. History just wasn't being driven by distinct personalities or rational leaders anymore. It was suddenly hijacked by the massive, rumbling subconscious drives of crowds. Humanity basically threw its hands up and surrendered to the extremes of nature and the raw, unthinking power of the collective.
Section 2. Ideologies. The cult of the object and the cult of the human.
So these newly untethered masses, they desperately needed a sanctuary. And in the absence of any real traditional safety, they fell prey to massive modern ideological cults. The first of these is what we'll call the cult of the object, essentially a religion of things. In systems like capitalism, humans aren't at the center anymore, the object is. People might believe they own things, but the reality is their entire existence becomes utterly subjugated to the mandate of wealth. Humans just become mere tools, literally cogs in a machine designed to serve the exact things they thought they possessed.
On the flip side, we have the cult of the human. You primarily see this in movements like fascism. Now, instead of worshiping property, this system revolves around the mummified, deeply mythologized power of a leader. It attempts to subordinate the material world to a grand, nationalistic legend. But as history clearly showed us, despite its terrifying facade and all that mythological energy, this cult was fundamentally weaker. In the end, it was completely crushed and defeated by the cold, calculated power of the cult of the object.
Now, you might be thinking capitalism and communism are total polar opposites, right? Well, actually, underneath it all, they share this glaring foundation. They are remarkably united in their worship of the object. Think about it. Capitalism crushes the human soul by subjugating it to property rights, while communism crushes it by subjugating humans to this rigid managerial authority over matter. In both systems, the human spirit is entirely secondary to the material world, which honestly perfectly explains how they could so easily ally to destroy the cult of the human during the Second World War.
To really wrap our heads around the bizarre nature of communism's rise in Russia, listen to this visceral comparison. Like a mule giving birth. It's shocking, right? It was this grotesque, totally unnatural hybrid that combined rigid managerial authority over objects with the suppressed, almost unacknowledged cult of the leader. It wasn't seen as some natural political evolution. It was viewed as a biological anomaly, a literal apocalyptic break from the laws of nature and tradition.
Section 3. Global Crisis and the Youth.
Decades of these soul-crushing cults? They caused some serious psychological fallout across the globe, and the youth were right at the absolute epicenter. The next generation basically inherited a world completely stripped of its spiritual center. And this global trauma showed up in some profound ways. First, the American youth retreated into heavy apathy, seeking escape in synthetic realities. Second, the European youth exploded into what was called an anarchy of immaturity, just sheer destructive rage. And third, within the communist bloc, from Hungary over to Turkestan, you hear a suppressed, silent scream. This was a true crisis of the soul trapped under iron-fisted material rule. Literally, every region was paralyzed by its own specific flavor of existential dread.
Section 4. Alienation and the Imitation disease.
While the West was dealing with all that apathy and rage, the Islamic geography was suffering from a deep, profound internal crisis known as the imitation disease. Look at the stark divide here. On one side, the intellectual class fell into this trap of mindlessly copying the external forms of foreign powers, wrongly equating mere imitation with real progress. On the other side, the public was desperately holding on to centuries-old local traditions and their authentic essence. And the tragic result? These intellectuals became total strangers to their own people. They didn't truly grasp the soul of the West, and they completely lost the soul of their own land.
And this alienation, it runs incredibly deep. We're not just talking about what clothes they wear or what books they read. It literally follows them all the way to the grave. The intellectual class, having lived completely severed from their roots, is buried in a way that is utterly devoid of local spiritual resonance. Their funerals look entirely different from the public's, which remain deeply rooted in communal tradition and prayer. Think about how sad that is, when a society's thinkers cannot even join their own people in death. The cultural severance is absolute.
You also have to understand that this cultural severance wasn't just some accident. The local voice was actively, systematically reduced to a whisper. Through heavy legal frameworks and massive societal pressure, indigenous thought was continuously marginalized. The true tragedy of this imitation disease is that it didn't just alienate a handful of thinkers, it created entire wasted generations who were just left drifting, without any true anchor in the modern world.
Section 5. The Historical Mission of the Islamic Geography.
Despite all this global crisis and deep-seated alienation, a philosophical turning point does finally emerge. A very specific historical mission falls upon the thinkers of the Islamic geography to offer a way out of this labyrinth. And this mission is beautifully captured by the metaphor, the trumpet of history has been blown. Because, look, modern technology has forcefully stitched the globe together into a single, unified entity. You can't hide anymore. Geographical and intellectual isolation are flat out impossible now. Every single idea and culture is forced onto the exact same global stage for a final reckoning.
So how exactly do we survive this reckoning? Well, the divine architecture solution lays out a pretty clear strategic roadmap. Step 1 is the absolute, uncompromising rejection of those soul-crushing cults we talked about. You've got to reject both the worship of the object and the mummification of the human. Step 2 requires a massive paradigm shift, explicitly declaring that both humans and objects are mere servants of a higher divine order. And Step 3? It calls upon intellectuals to stop imitating, step up, and actively act as the architects of a new, unified humanity, providing a real metaphysical shield against modern subjugation.
Which brings us to our final, really critical question. The trumpet of history is sounding. How much of a share will we have in this new establishment? We've explored a world completely torn apart by false idols and profound alienation, and the warning here is crystal clear. Failing to offer a new architectural vision for humanity will inevitably lead to total subjugation in whatever new world order emerges next. We simply cannot afford to be passive observers. In a world this desperate for meaning, what role are you going to play in building it? Take a moment to really ponder that. Thanks so much for joining me today, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.